Have you ever imagined an ancient nation, a civilization thousands of years old, once the proud symbol of African independence, being plunged into a nightmarish abyss? A period where the very government, sworn to protect its people, wielded absolute fear and starvation as devastating weapons against its own citizens. This isn't a dystopian sci-fi movie, nor is it some dark fairy tale. This is the brutal, harrowing truth of what happened in Ethiopia. A dark chapter, stained with blood and tears, in modern history. A time when hundreds of thousands were brutally murdered, and millions more faced agonizing deaths from famine, not merely a natural disaster, but a horrifying political instrument. Today, we're going to rewind time, back to Ethiopia in the 1970s and 1980s, to understand and bear witness to the profound tragedy known as the Mengistu Haile Mariam regime. Prepare yourselves, for this is a story of power, cruelty, and the indomitable spirit of a nation. Our story begins in 1974. Before this, Ethiopia was an ancient empire, ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie I, a legendary figure revered by many Ethiopians as a descendant of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. He was a symbol of African independence, a key architect of the Organization of African Unity. Yet, beneath his majestic exterior, the empire was decaying from within. Social inequality was rampant, localized famine simmered, and the elite lived in opulent luxury while the vast majority of the population languished in abject poverty. This simmering discontent finally erupted. In September 1974, a military coup took place. Though relatively bloodless at that precise moment, the rumble of tanks crushing the streets of Addis Ababa signaled a fundamental shift. Emperor Haile Selassie was deposed, ending centuries of monarchy. Power quickly fell into the hands of the Derg, an Amharic acronym for the Coordinating Committee of the Armed Forces, Police, and Territorial Army, a council of junior military officers. Initially, the Derg promised a bright future. They proclaimed they would abolish feudalism, bring social justice, redistribute land to the impoverished farmers, and build a modern, egalitarian Ethiopia on socialist principles. The Ethiopian people, utterly exhausted by the oppression and poverty of the old regime, initially placed much hope in these revolutionary soldiers. But that dream swiftly curdled into a terrifying nightmare, as one figure rose to consolidate absolute power, Major Mengistu Haile Mariam. Mengistu, an artillery officer with a notoriously ruthless temperament and an unquenchable thirst for power, quickly eliminated his rivals within the Derg. He espoused an extreme, uncompromising Marxist-Leninist ideology, mechanically copied from the Soviet Union and Cuba. For Mengistu, to build his ideal communist society, every enemy of the revolution had to be ruthlessly purged. And instead of peaceful reform, he chose a path of the most brutal violence and repression imaginable. To eliminate all opposition, from royalists seeking to restore the empire, to students and intellectuals demanding democracy, to rival Marxist groups with different visions for Ethiopia's future, Mengistu launched a campaign of bloody purges known as the Red Terror. This campaign reached its horrifying peak between 1977 and 1978, but in reality, it stretched longer, sowing terror across the entire nation. Mengistu himself openly declared, "There is no need to waste time on legal procedures for reactionaries." This was a chilling green light, granting his soldiers and security forces permission to kill with impunity. This purge wasn't just aimed at obvious political opponents, it targeted anyone suspected of dissenting thought, even a minor complaint or a fleeting look of disapproval. Tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of innocent Ethiopians, were arrested, brutally tortured, and executed without any semblance of trial. Their bodies were often left strewn across the streets of Addis Ababa and other cities, with chilling placards pinned to their chests, declaring, "Reactionaries killed." Family members were even forced to pay for the bullets used to execute their loved ones to reclaim their bodies, an act of unimaginable cruelty. Addis Ababa Stadium, once a vibrant venue for soccer matches, was transformed into a colossal prison, a center for torture and summary executions. At night, the sounds of gunshots echoed relentlessly, the screams of victims drowned out by blaring revolutionary music. Families living nearby dared not sleep, haunted by the horrific sounds. A palpable fear enveloped the entire country, turning everyone into a potential suspect and every glance into suspicion. Children were forced to denounce their parents, and neighbors informed on each other to save themselves. Young people, especially students, those who had initially spearheaded the calls for change, were prime targets of the Red Terror. They were deemed independent thinkers, seeds of rebellion that needed to be uprooted. An entire generation of Ethiopia's burgeoning intelligentsia was annihilated in this bloody campaign. No one was safe. Those who committed these atrocities were known as Kitamai, the first ones, and their actions left an indelible scar on the soul of the Ethiopian people. But Mengistu's reign of terror wasn't limited to direct political violence. He weaponized famine as a brutal political tool to consolidate power and crush dissenting regions. Ethiopia has historically been prone to droughts. However, the famine under Mengistu was not merely a natural disaster, it was a deadly combination of harsh weather and the regime's extreme, irrational socio-economic policies. Flawed agricultural policies, such as forced collectivization of land without adequate tools or training, decimated food production. Farmers were compelled to sell their produce to the state at rock-bottom prices, stripping them of any incentive to grow more. Agricultural goods were forcibly requisitioned to feed the military and to be exported for foreign currency, even as local populations starved. The consequence was the horrific Great Famine of 1984 to 1985, one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes of the 20th century. Over 1 million people perished during this famine. Yet, instead of dedicating all resources to saving its people, the Mengistu government prioritized immense military spending for its wars against the rebel groups in Tigray and Eritrea. What's even more outrageous is that the government actively obstructed or prevented humanitarian aid from reaching the most severely affected regions, especially those controlled by or sympathetic to rebel groups. Foreign aid was heavily taxed, diverted for military purposes, or simply delayed in a monstrously inhumane manner. Mengistu even argued that providing aid to these regions would prolong the war and empower the rebels. Furthermore, Mengistu implemented a large-scale forced resettlement program. Hundreds of thousands of people from the drought-stricken northern regions were coerced into moving to southwestern areas, under the pretext of creating better production conditions. But the relocation process was chaotic, disorganized, and lacked sufficient food, water, or infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands more died during the journey from disease, hunger, or exhaustion. This wasn't a development program, it was a demographic strategy to isolate and weaken rebel groups, while concentrating the population in more easily controllable areas. The famine under Mengistu was not just a natural disaster, it was a direct consequence of a brutal policy where human lives were sacrificed for the sake of political ambition and the maintenance of a tyrannical regime. This atrocity shocked the conscience of the world, yet Mengistu remained cold and unwavering. Despite the ruthless suppression of the Red Terror and the weaponization of famine, public discontent and rebellion continued to simmer, then erupted with ever-increasing force. The people simply could not endure anymore. Rebel groups like the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, in the north and the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, in the northern region of Eritrea grew into formidable military forces. They garnered widespread support from local populations, who were utterly fed up with the Mengistu regime. Years of relentless warfare had utterly exhausted Ethiopia's already fragile economy. The Soviet Union, which had been a crucial pillar of support for the Mengistu regime, began to withdraw its aid in the late 1980s due to political changes back home. This significantly weakened Mengistu's grip on power. The news tightened around Addis Ababa. Rebel forces, having achieved successive victories on the battlefield, closed in on the capital. Facing inevitable defeat, on May 21, 1991, Mengistu Haile Mariam was forced to flee, seeking asylum in Zimbabwe. The 17-year dictatorship, which had inflicted unimaginable crimes and horrors, finally crumbled. As rebel forces entered Addis Ababa, a palpable sense of relief spread across the nation. But this liberation came at an unfathomable cost. Mengistu left behind a shattered country, with a collapsed economy, devastated infrastructure, and millions of unhealed wounds in the hearts of its people. The fall of the Mengistu regime marked a new chapter for Ethiopia, a nation that has since striven to rebuild from the ashes. But the legacy of the Red Terror and the famine continues to cast a long shadow. Millions of families lost loved ones, permanently torn apart. The fear remains deeply etched in the memories of generations of Ethiopians. Mengistu Haile Mariam was later convicted in absentia of genocide by an Ethiopian court in 2006. Though he remains in exile in Zimbabwe, never having faced direct justice, this conviction serves as a recognition of the horrific crimes he perpetrated. The story of Ethiopia under Mengistu is a poignant and painful reminder of the dangers of absolute power, of dictatorship, and the brutality of policies that prioritize ideology over human lives. It starkly and cruelly demonstrates how fear and starvation can be weaponized to serve the political ends of a regime. History is a mirror for us to gaze into and learn from. What happened in Ethiopia is not just a sorrowful chapter in one nation's past, it is a universal lesson for all humanity about the imperative to protect human rights, uphold the value of every human life, and resist all forms of tyranny, no matter how they are disguised. To understand these tragic pages of history more deeply and to ensure that the innocent victims are never forgotten, Please leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on the lessons learned from Ethiopia's story. Let's make sure these conversations continue. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more compelling and crucial historical narratives.